Assalamu alaikum. Dear students, I have devised this simple apparatus to elaborate or explain all the four inversions of the slider crank or crank slider chain. At this stage, we must know the difference between this terminology crank slider or slider crank. According to the book of Design of Machinery by R.L. Norton, that states that if we speak crank slider, that means input is given to the crank and output is obtained at the slider, just like in compressor system. Whereas if we speak slider crank, that means input is given to the slider or piston. So this is the slider. For example, in internal combustion engine, the expanding gases actually push this piston, which actually through this connecting rod link moves the crank, and which in result actually revolve this crank pin, and the transmission system actually revolves or moves the wheels. So this is the difference between these two terms. Now I will be showing all the four inversions turn by turn. So in the first inversion, actually the slider block translates. So that inversion is actually obtained when we move this crank. So crank is actually revolving and the slider block is actually translating on this black link, which is actually stationary or ground at this inversion number 1. After that, the inversion number 2, for inversion number 2 we can temporarily make the crank or the smallest link stationary. So I will be holding this link in my hand and I will be showing the motion of the other links like this. As we can observe in this type of motion, actually the slider block is in complex motion. And the ground and the connecting rod are in rocking motion or just oscillating. Their one joint, this joint and this joint are grounded revolute, and they are just like the rocking movement or rocker oscillations. In inversion number 3, I will be holding this connecting rod and I will be moving the crank like this, and in this inversion, as we can observe, the slider block is actually oscillating or rotating. As we can observe, this slider block is rotating about its pivot. And the last inversion is where the slider block is actually stationary. So here we can make it stationary like this, and that inversion will be like this. As we can observe, that inversion will be working like this, and this type of inversion is used in conventional hand pump. In rural areas we can observe this the application of this mechanism. So these are all the 4 inversions. This last inversion I have created a separate mechanism or separate apparatus for this. Here we can observe that this is the fourth inversion and it is actually working like this, and this is actually now the cylinder which is actually translating, and this is the piston or slider which is actually stationary at this inversion, and this is the inversion which is used for a hand pump mechanism, and this portion actually sucks the water from underground, and here we actually install the handle in the extended position, and actually the movement is actually like this in the hand pump, and here we can observe that this link which actually in inversion number inversion number 1 was crank is in complex motion, and this link which actually was the connecting rod in the inversion number 1 is actually in the rocking or oscillatory motion, which is actually in pure rotation about this revolute, and this is actually the slider. This is actually the cylinder. This is actually the cylinder. This is the slider. This is actually the cylinder which is actually now translating, which was actually fixed in the inversion number 1. So this was in inversion number 1, it was fixed. Now it is actually translating. So in this way, this actually explains the mechanism of hand pump. So thanks for watching and tolerating. Assalamu alaikum.